Listen closely. In 1867, a child was examined by men who believed they understood the laws of nature, yet what they saw made them step back in silence, as if something ancient had just looked through human eyes. This is not a story meant to comfort you. This is a door. And once you step through it, you don't return the same. The year is 1867. America is bruised, rebuilding itself after blood and fire. Science is confident, almost arrogant. Doctors believe they can measure the soul with calipers and explain the mind with ink and bone. Institutions are forming rules for what is normal, what is sane, what is human. And then this child appears, quiet, observant, wrong in ways no chart can explain. He does not scream. He does not thrash. He watches. Adults feel exposed around him, as if their thoughts have become audible. Teachers report that he knows answers before questions are finished. Physicians note irregularities they can't name, only circle in red ink. His pulse changes under observation. His eyes do not track light the way they should. And when pressed, when isolated, when tested, he does something deeply unsettling, he adapts. The records don't call him supernatural. They call him anomaly, deviation, problem. Because institutions never name what threatens their authority. They rename it until it fits inside a drawer. But this child never fits. Every attempt to categorize him only reveals another layer that shouldn't exist. What matters is not whether the child was gifted, cursed, or something else entirely. What matters is what happened next. Because the moment science fails, power becomes afraid. And when power becomes afraid, it stops asking questions and starts building cages. You need to understand this story is not about a child. It's about control. It's about how institutions react when something appears that exposes the limits of their knowledge. The child becomes a mirror, reflecting back a truth no system wants to face, that reality does not answer to authority. The doctors document him obsessively. The clergy argue over him in private letters. Government officials quietly request reports they pretend not to care about. And in those reports, you begin to see the real fear, not of the child, but of what he implies. If one mind can exist outside the rules, then the rules themselves are fragile. As you listen, don't think of this as history. Think of it as a pattern. Because what happened in 1867 did not end in 1867. It refined itself. It learned how to hide. And before this descent is over, you'll recognize the same mechanisms still shaping your world today. The first official report describes the child as calm to the point of concern. That single sentence unsettles the men who read it. Calm is acceptable in adults. In children, it suggests something unfinished, or something already complete. The physicians expect fear. They expect confusion. Instead, they encounter stillness. Not emptiness. Stillness with weight. They begin with measurements. Skull circumference. Eye response. Muscle reflex. Every test designed to reduce him into numbers. But the numbers refuse to behave. His reactions are inconsistent, not randomly, but selectively, almost as if he understands when he is being measured and chooses when to comply. One doctor notes that the child's gaze lingers too long. Another writes that it feels like being evaluated by the subject. That line is crossed out in later copies, but not erased deeply enough. You can still see it if you know where to look. This is the moment the story changes. Because science is comfortable with ignorance. It is not comfortable with reversal. The instant the observer feels observed, hierarchy collapses. And hierarchy is the true foundation of every institution pretending to seek truth. The child begins predicting outcomes. Not in dramatic declarations. Quietly. Casually. He tells an orderly which glass will shatter when dropped. He tells a nurse which patient will die before morning rounds. When questioned, he does not claim foresight. He says, simply, it's already decided. That phrase circulates among the staff like a sickness. Determinism is a dangerous idea in an era obsessed with progress. If outcomes are fixed, then effort is an illusion. If effort is an illusion, then authority loses its justification. So the language changes. The child is no longer unusual. He becomes unstable. His insights become episodes. His calm becomes emotional deficit. Labels appear not to explain him, but to protect the system from what he reveals. This is how suppression always begins. Not with chains, but with terminology. You should recognize this pattern. When a truth threatens control, it is reframed as pathology. When a man sees through the illusion, he is told something is wrong with him. The institution does not ask whether it is blind. It diagnoses the one who can see. By the end of the year, access to the child is restricted. Clergy are barred. Journalists turned away. Even senior physicians require approval. Knowledge is being quarantined. Not because the child is dangerous, but because he makes danger visible. And once seen, it cannot be unseen. Isolation changes most children. It bends them inward. It fractures their sense of time. But this child does not fracture. He sharpens. Removed from voices, from faces, from daylight, he begins constructing something internal, an architecture of thought untouched by supervision. The records describe him as withdrawn, yet his journals tell a different story. He is not retreating. He is organizing. They give him paper to monitor deterioration. What they receive instead unsettles them more than silence ever could. The child writes in clean, deliberate lines, observations about the people watching him. He notes their routines, their inconsistencies, the way their confidence erodes in the evenings. He does not name emotions. He categorizes behaviors. As if studying a different species. One entry survives intact. They believe truth arrives from effort. They do not see that effort is used to avoid truth. That sentence never appears in the official archive. It exists only in a private copy, hidden inside a personal correspondence between two physicians who later stop writing to each other altogether. This is where fear mutates. The institution begins to suspect that the child is not merely perceiving outcomes, but systems. Cause, effect, delay, denial. He recognizes patterns the way other children recognize faces. And once patterns are visible, manipulation becomes obvious. Tests escalate. Sleep deprivation. Sensory disruption. Moral questioning. They attempt to provoke emotional response, hoping to find a breaking point. Instead, the child begins answering questions that were never asked. When told a story designed to confuse him, he finishes it correctly. When presented with paradoxes, he resolves them without effort, then asks why adults pretend not to understand what is simple. That question is marked defiant. Understand this: authority cannot tolerate simplicity. Complexity keeps people dependent. When something cuts through illusion cleanly, it threatens every hierarchy built on confusion. By now, outside pressure grows. Word leaks, not details, but unease. Letters arrive from officials who never state their interest openly. Funding increases quietly. New observers appear who do not take notes. They watch reactions instead of results. The child notices them immediately. He stops speaking when they enter the room. Not out of fear. Out of refusal. One witness describes the sensation as being erased. Another resigns the same week. There is no exit interview. This is the point where the narrative fractures. Some records vanish. Others contradict each other. Dates shift. Ages change. It becomes impossible to reconstruct a clean timeline, and that is intentional. Confusion is not a failure of documentation. It is a defensive mechanism. Because if the story remains unclear, the implications remain containable. But clarity is coming. And when it arrives, it will not ask permission. You are not meant to hear this story as history. You are meant to recognize it as a rehearsal. By the third year, the child is no longer treated as a patient. He is treated as a variable. Something to be adjusted, suppressed, observed at a distance. Compassion drains out of the language entirely. Words like care and development disappear, replaced by control and containment. This is how institutions prepare themselves to cross moral lines without feeling the weight of it. They begin running parallel evaluations. One set of reports describes improvement. Another, classified and unsigned, describes risk. The contradiction is deliberate. It allows whoever reads the file to choose the version that supports their intent. Truth becomes modular, assembled differently depending on who needs it. The child's behavior shifts again. Not dramatically. Subtly. He stops predicting small outcomes. No more shattered glasses. No more deaths before dawn. Instead, he starts speaking about sequences. Chains of events. Systems moving toward collapse. He tells a physician that the hospital will change leadership within 2 winters. It does. He tells a visiting official that his authority will end without noise. 6 months later, the man is reassigned, quietly erased from public record. At this point, fear becomes policy. A closed committee forms. No minutes are kept. Membership rotates. The stated purpose is ethical oversight, but no ethicist is present. Only administrators, legal minds, and men trained to protect structures rather than people. The child is never invited into these discussions. He is the subject, not the participant. Yet he knows. He begins preparing. He asks for fewer interactions. Less light. More time alone. This is misinterpreted as regression. In reality, it is consolidation. He is withdrawing from stimuli that do not matter, refining focus. One attendant notices that when he is left undisturbed, the air in the room feels different, heavy, attentive, as if something is listening through him. That comment is removed from the record. The attendant is reassigned to inventory. The institution begins considering permanent solutions. Not death. That would leave questions. Instead, disappearance. Transfer. Reclassification. Something clean. Something administrative. The kind of ending that generates no martyrs. You should understand what's happening here. When a system cannot dominate something, it does not destroy it publicly. It buries it quietly and moves on, pretending the threat never existed. This is how forbidden knowledge survives, fragmented, hidden, carried forward in whispers rather than monuments. The child senses the narrowing corridor. He begins leaving messages in places no one thinks to check. Margins. Gaps. Assumptions. He understands that memory is more resilient than record. One final note appears, dated but unsigned. They think containment ends influence. They do not understand propagation. After that, the documentation thins. Transfers are mentioned but never confirmed. Names are replaced with numbers. And then, nothing. The file ends without closure. No conclusion. No explanation. Just absence. Absence is not emptiness. It is a signal. After the last official entry, the child does not vanish from reality, only from permission. The institution behaves as though silence equals resolution, but silence is merely pressure redirected. The influence moves underground, where it cannot be audited or restrained. Years later, fragments surface in unrelated places. A marginal note in a medical journal referencing an unclassifiable juvenile cognition. A sermon transcript warning of children born without the veil. A private letter between 2 industrialists discussing a consultation that knew outcomes before capital was committed. None of these sources name the child. None of them need to. What matters is the recurrence of the same unease. The same implication, that something was set in motion and allowed to disperse. This is where the myth begins to harden around the history. Some say the child was transferred to a remote facility under a different name. Others claim he was placed with a family selected not for care, but for obscurity. A more disturbing theory suggests he was never moved at all, that he was taught to disappear in place, rendered invisible by compliance so perfect it looked like absence. Consider that for a moment. Not escape. Not rebellion. Mastery of invisibility through predictability. Institutions cannot track what conforms flawlessly. Surveillance depends on deviation. The child understood this. He learned how to pass as nothing. Meanwhile, the men who encountered him do not fare well. Several suffer breakdowns. One destroys his own notes before dying of an illness diagnosed too late. Another retreats into religious extremism, obsessed with the idea that knowledge itself is a sin that must be contained. Guilt seeks structure when it cannot find absolution. The most telling detail appears decades later, buried in a congressional appendix no one reads. A reference to cognitive outliers requiring early identification and corrective normalization. No explanation. No origin cited. Just policy language, cold, efficient, impersonal. The child did not disappear. He became a template. From this point forward, anything that deviates too cleanly from expectation is flagged. Giftedness becomes suspect. Pattern recognition becomes disorder. Calm insight becomes emotional deficit. The system evolves, learning how to preempt the next anomaly before it can be named. This is the real legacy of 1867. Not a mystery child, but a shift in strategy. You live inside the descendants of these protocols. Educational models. Psychological diagnostics. Social conditioning mechanisms that reward noise and punish clarity. You are taught to confuse stimulation with intelligence, reaction with awareness. And if you ever step too far outside the pattern, you are not confronted. You are corrected. The child taught them how dangerous awareness could be. And they taught the world how to bury it. By the turn of the century, the language has fully transformed. What began as fear becomes doctrine. What began as an anomaly becomes a category. New institutions emerge claiming to protect children, educate minds, standardize potential. Their stated mission is progress. Their unspoken function is filtration. You see, once a system encounters something it cannot explain, it does not wait for it to happen again. It builds nets. Curricula are redesigned. Not to awaken insight, but to pace it. Too fast becomes disruptive. Too quiet becomes suspicious. Teachers are trained to reward visible effort over silent comprehension. The child who understands without struggle is no longer praised. He is watched. This is not coincidence. It is adaptation. Psychology enters the public sphere wearing the mask of care. Diagnostic frameworks multiply. The question is no longer what do you see, but where do you fit? A mind that does not require reinforcement threatens the authority of the reinforcer. Behind closed doors, files circulate referencing predictive cognition and premature system recognition. These are not published. They are discussed in private symposia attended by men who believe stability matters more than truth. And still, echoes of the child appear. A boy in Ohio who refuses to play games because he already knows who will win. A student in Massachusetts who stops answering questions because teachers mistake certainty for arrogance. A quiet adolescent who writes a letter predicting a factory collapse months before it happens, and is told to stop imagining disasters. Each case is handled cleanly. Individually. No connections acknowledged. Because to connect them would be to admit a pattern. Here is the part you are not meant to notice: the system does not eliminate these minds. It redirects them. Into analytics. Into logistics. Into financial modeling. Fields where prediction serves power instead of challenging it. Awareness is not destroyed. It is conscripted. The child from 1867 becomes a ghost in the machine. Not a person, but a principle. A reminder that some minds see through the narrative layer straight into structure. And that such vision must be either owned or neutralized. Ask yourself why the most powerful systems in the modern world run on predictive models. Why foresight is celebrated in markets but discouraged in individuals. Why intuition is monetized at the top and medicated at the bottom. This is not hypocrisy. It is strategy. The descent you are on is not about uncovering a forgotten boy. It is about recognizing a lineage of control that learned how to camouflage itself as progress. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. At some point, control stops looking like force and starts looking like preference. That is the most advanced stage. By then, no one needs to be restrained. They restrain themselves, believing the limits were chosen freely. This is where the child's shadow becomes hardest to trace. By the 1920s, institutional language has perfected its disguise. Words like optimization, adjustment, wellness, and productivity enter the bloodstream of society. They sound neutral, helpful. But neutrality is the most effective camouflage power has ever invented. Children who see too clearly are no longer isolated in rooms with white walls. They are surrounded by noise. Endless stimulation. Distraction engineered to fragment attention before coherence can form. A mind that never becomes still never discovers pattern. The child from 1867 understood something fundamental: stillness is where structure reveals itself. So the system ensures stillness is rare. Silence is uncomfortable. Reflection is framed as inefficiency. And any prolonged withdrawal is labeled unhealthy. This is not cultural drift. It is countermeasure. Look closely at how modern environments are designed. The constant interruptions. The artificial urgency. The demand to react before understanding. These are not accidents. Reaction bypasses awareness. Speed prevents synthesis. A man who never slows down never realizes he is being guided. Somewhere in the archives of the early intelligence community, a phrase appears repeatedly: preemptive normalization. It refers to shaping perception before deviation emerges. Not correcting after the fact, but preventing the question from ever forming. The child's legacy forced this evolution. Because what truly frightened the institutions was not his predictions. It was his immunity. He did not seek approval. He did not fear consequence. He did not confuse authority with truth. Those traits cannot be argued against. They must be dissolved early. So identity itself becomes the target. You are taught who you are before you can observe yourself. Labels arrive first. Roles second. Expectations last. By the time awareness stirs, it is already enclosed by language chosen for you. The child did not have this enclosure. That is why he was dangerous. And that is why the system learned to build the enclosure first. This is the part of the descent where discomfort should start to feel familiar. Not fear, recognition. Because you are not just hearing about control. You are remembering moments when you sensed it, felt it press against your own perception, and dismissed it as imagination. It was not imagination. It was early awareness, quietly corrected. There is a moment, rarely discussed, when suppression stops being external and becomes internal. That moment is the true victory of any system built on control. By then, the walls are no longer visible because they exist inside the mind. The child from 1867 never reached that moment. That is why his presence caused such unease. He did not hesitate before knowing. He did not second-guess clarity. Doubt had not yet been installed as a virtue. And without doubt, manipulation has nowhere to attach itself. So the system learned something crucial: you do not need to silence awareness if you can teach it to distrust itself. By the mid-20th century, this lesson is fully operational. Men are encouraged to question their instincts but not the structures around them. To analyze themselves endlessly while accepting external narratives as fixed reality. Self-scrutiny becomes a trap. Awareness turns inward and eats itself. This is framed as maturity. The child's ability was never supernatural. That is the lie designed to distance you from it. What he possessed was coherence. The ability to hold still long enough to see cause and effect without emotional distortion. To notice what others rush past. To recognize patterns not because he was gifted, but because he was unfragmented. Fragmentation is the real weapon. Divide attention. Divide identity. Divide time. When a man's awareness is split across too many inputs, nothing fully forms. He becomes reactive instead of perceptive. Busy instead of dangerous. The institutions call this engagement. But in private documents, a different term appears: cognitive saturation. Flood the channel so nothing meaningful passes through. Keep the signal buried under noise. This is why silence now feels unnatural. Why boredom feels like failure. Why a man alone with his thoughts reaches for distraction before insight arrives. The reflex is conditioned. Automatic. Protective of the system, not of you. The child never had that reflex. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if nothing was wrong with him at all? What if he represented a baseline state, one that modern life is carefully engineered to prevent? If that thought unsettles you, it should. Because it implies that awareness is not rare. It is suppressed. And suppression only works if you participate in it unconsciously. The descent deepens here because now the question turns toward you. What have you been trained not to notice? Once awareness is framed as a problem, obedience no longer requires force. It requires only routine. This is the quiet genius of modern control systems. They do not threaten. They schedule. Look back at the child again. What made him impossible to manage was not that he resisted. It was that he did not need direction. He was self-orienting. And any system built on hierarchy cannot tolerate a mind that does not look upward for validation. So the architecture of modern life is constructed to prevent self-orientation from ever stabilizing. Time is segmented. Days are chopped into obligations. Attention is leased out in small fragments that never recombine. Even rebellion is packaged, given slogans, approved outlets, controlled release. Nothing raw is allowed to remain unprocessed. This is where the child story becomes mythic. Because by now, the child is no longer a person. He is an archetype the system is designed to prevent from re-emerging. Not by elimination, but by dilution. Spread awareness thin enough and it loses its edge. Men are taught to define themselves through external markers. Status. Productivity. Visibility. Noise. The inner axis, the quiet place where pattern recognition lives, is left undeveloped. Not discouraged openly. Just neglected until it atrophies. And when a man senses that something is missing, the system offers substitutes. Entertainment for meaning. Stimulation for depth. Endless information in place of understanding. The hunger is real, but it is misfed on purpose. This is psychological control at its most refined. No chains. No cells. Just a constant redirection away from stillness. The child could not be redirected. He did not crave approval. He did not need distraction. He did not confuse movement with progress. That combination made him incompatible with managed reality. Ask yourself why modern systems fear men who can sit quietly without reaching for input. Why silence is associated with weakness or instability. Why certainty without credentials is mocked. Those reactions are not cultural accidents. They are immune responses. The institutions learned long ago that the most dangerous man is not the angry one. It is the calm one who sees the pattern and does not panic. The one who cannot be rushed. The one who does not need consensus to know what is real. That man does not need permission. And permission is the currency of control. The child from 1867 never asked for it. And that is why his story was buried. At the center of every control system is a contradiction it must never acknowledge. It claims to exist for protection, yet it is terrified of those who require none. The child represented that contradiction in its purest form. By now, the institutions have learned to mask fear as responsibility. When they intervene, they call it care. When they restrict, they call it safety. And when they erase, they call it oversight. Language is the final layer of containment. The child's file, though officially closed, becomes required reading in certain circles. Not as history, but as warning. A case study in what happens when awareness emerges unmediated. When a mind bypasses conditioning and moves straight into structure. The lesson drawn is not how to understand such a mind. It is how to prevent it. Educational systems introduce constant evaluation. Psychological frameworks prioritize normalization. Social environments reward conformity disguised as belonging. Every layer reinforces the same message: clarity without consensus is dangerous. This is why men are trained to outsource their judgment. To experts. To panels. To algorithms. Responsibility is framed as burden. Independence as risk. The more dependent a man becomes, the safer the system feels. The child never outsourced. That refusal echoes through time. By the mid-century, predictive capability becomes the crown jewel of power. Governments invest heavily in forecasting. Corporations build empires on anticipation. Militaries run simulations endlessly, attempting to see the future before it arrives. Notice the irony. Prediction is celebrated when centralized. Feared when individual. The same faculty that unsettled doctors in 1867 becomes invaluable when owned by institutions. The difference is not the ability. It is who controls it. This is the pivot point of the descent. Because now you are close enough to see the mechanism clearly. The system does not hate awareness. It hates uncontrolled awareness. The child was never a threat because he knew things early. He was a threat because no one could tell him what to know, when to know it, or how to interpret it. That kind of mind cannot be directed. Only delayed. And delay is enough. Every year awareness is postponed, habits calcify. Identity solidifies. The window closes. What could have been obvious becomes unthinkable. The child existed before that window was sealed. You did not. But the echo remains. The more you study systems, the more you realize that fear is not the engine of control, it is convenience. Fear requires effort. Threats require monitoring. True domination is subtler. It is shaping the mind so the subject enforces the boundaries themselves, without being told. This is why the child was terrifying. He never internalized boundaries. Every test, every observation, every attempt to manipulate him failed because he did not recognize authority as a prerequisite for action. He operated on pattern alone. On reality unfiltered by expectation. The men documenting him begin to experience what they cannot name. Anxiety becomes personal. Decisions made for years without thought now seem fragile. Every outcome is questioned internally before it is questioned externally. They record this unease, but never admit its source. It is the kind of insight too dangerous to formalize. Because once documented, it becomes a threat. The child exposed an uncomfortable truth, that understanding is independent of rank. That vision does not require sanction. That clarity exists before hierarchy. And hierarchy cannot survive exposure to unmediated clarity. By now, a quiet war is underway. Not with armies or weapons. With observation, interruption, and recalibration. Every interaction with a child becomes a probe. Every response, a dataset. The objective is not comprehension. It is containment. The more contained he becomes, the more the adult observers spiral. Logic itself begins to feel insufficient. They question the foundation of their education. Their experience. Their very sense of time and sequence. And they write reports to reassure themselves that the child is abnormal, when in truth, their own certainty is unraveling. This is the key pattern you must recognize: authority always pathologizes what it cannot manage. Control never acknowledges that the anomaly might be a mirror. That it might reflect the fragility of the observer rather than the deviation of the observed. The child's calm, his quiet observation, his predictive clarity, they are all mirrors. They show the observer's fear, not the child's power. And here lies the danger, because once you see the mirror, you can no longer pretend. You feel the absence of the blinders that everyone else wears, and suddenly, the machinery of control becomes visible. You see the strings they hide in plain sight, and the consequences of that sight are immediate. The child did not teach this consciously. He did not need to. His presence, his patterns, his simple stillness, were enough. And that is why the institutions feared him more than any loud or violent threat. The knowledge he represents is still alive. Still operative. Still buried under layers of distraction, division, and noise. And it will find you if you seek it. By now, the child is no longer merely a subject. He is a blueprint. A template for how the unobserved mind can unravel control without raising a single alarm. And the system recognizes this. Every measure, every reform, every new regulation that emerges afterward carries his echo, carefully masked as routine progress. Notice the pattern. Education. Psychology. Corporate training. Social norms. None of it designed to cultivate insight for the individual. Everything is designed to standardize response, to predict behavior before insight can crystallize. Men who might see patterns too early are shepherded into conformity. Curiosity is tolerated only when it serves the machine. The child's file contains hints of recognition. He knows the observers are trapped in their own timelines. He notices cause and effect in their hesitation, their attempts at reassurance, their careful documentation. They try to conceal it, but he sees. And seeing is not passive. Seeing is power. So what does the system do with power it cannot suppress? It absorbs it. Not by force. By co-opting the conditions under which it can manifest. Predictive cognition becomes profitable. Pattern recognition is monetized. Forecasting becomes worshipped, but only when centralized. The individual who knows too much outside the sanctioned channels becomes a liability. And this is the lesson they never put in textbooks: knowledge is never neutral. It is always either property or threat. To possess it without sanction is dangerous. To lack it entirely is safe. And the child sat precisely at the intersection of the unsanctioned and the inevitable. He observes. He calculates. He adapts. And yet, he never resists overtly. Resistance would have been easy. But the institutions would have survived confrontation. The real terror lies in quiet, in invisibility, in comprehension that cannot be monitored, measured, or manipulated. The child understands that influence does not need permission. The men around him cannot comprehend that autonomy is not something to be granted, it exists inherently. That realization shakes them more than any act of defiance. And now, the template spreads, silently, methodically. Generations of structures are built to mimic suppression while appearing benign. Institutions, markets, educational systems, even entertainment, follow the same formula: predict, redirect, control. Every modern mechanism that shapes thought carries fragments of what the child exposed. Your awareness, right now, is the echo of that same pattern. Every distraction, every expectation, every internalized boundary, the machinery is operating, and you are inside it. By this point, the story of the child has become more than historical anomaly, it has transformed into a lesson in invisibility and survival. Not survival of the body, but survival of mind and influence. He does not fight the system directly. He outmaneuvers it, quietly, methodically, as a predator of awareness rather than a target of authority. The observers, doctors, clergy, administrators, begin to realize that their methods fail not because he resists, but because he perceives the structure beneath their interventions. Every test, every question, every attempt to elicit response is already anticipated. The child's understanding does not conform to their expectations, it transcends them. And that is the true danger. Notice how this mirrors the world you inhabit. Systems do not fear loud rebellion. They fear quiet comprehension. They tolerate anger, chaos, and confusion because those can be measured, directed, and neutralized. What they cannot tolerate is clarity that requires no validation. Insight that is unmediated. Awareness that cannot be quantified. The child, in effect, is a prototype of the untamed observer. And systems respond to prototypes in one of two ways: assimilation or eradication. Assimilation centralizes power, extracts value, and converts the anomaly into utility. Eradication masks it, buries it, and pretends it never existed. The child experiences both. His later life, if it can even be traced, reflects careful manipulation of these strategies: never submission, never exposure. And the institutions are honest about one thing: containment is more effective than confrontation. Remove the threat from sight. Redirect the environment. Flood perception with noise until insight atrophies. Teach the mind to doubt itself. Teach it to seek external approval for recognition of reality. Teach it that clarity is dangerous. This is the mechanism you live inside. Not metaphorically, but literally. Every distraction, every division, every constant input, your attention is constantly being farmed, filtered, and redirected. It is designed so that even the sharpest mind spends most of its energy reacting rather than perceiving. Halfway through this journey, it is time to mark a threshold. Write down these words in the comments twice: I see the pattern, I claim awareness. Do it not for me, but to anchor yourself. The act is symbolic. It signals to your mind and the algorithms that you are no longer passive. That you acknowledge the machinery and are choosing, consciously, to observe. The child from 1867 understood this instinctively. He did not need ritual or approval to maintain focus. But you can begin your version now, deliberately, intentionally, and with awareness. From this point, the descent shifts from observation to comprehension. You are no longer merely learning the story, you are tracing the architecture behind it. The child's significance is not in what he did, but in what he revealed: how power reacts to uncontained perception. And once you recognize that, you begin to see it everywhere. Institutions do not act randomly. Every rule, every procedure, every protocol is designed with anticipation in mind. The same principles that guided the doctor's fear in 1867 are embedded in bureaucracies today. Predictive systems, surveillance frameworks, administrative hierarchies, they all operate on one formula: identify anomalies early, standardize outcomes, neutralize deviations quietly. And deviations are never violent. They are subtle, incremental, invisible. A student who excels too quickly is redirected into conformity. An employee who thinks independently is assigned mundane tasks to dull initiative. A citizen who perceives patterns is bombarded with distraction until discernment dissolves. The system does not break minds outright, it teaches them to limit themselves. The child understood this instinctively. His stillness, his observation, his precise calibration of response allowed him to navigate layers of containment without exposure. He did not submit. He did not resist. He merely existed, fully aware, in a space the system could not map. That is why his influence, though obscured, persists. Each layer of suppression, each carefully constructed norm, carries the fingerprints of what he taught power: that awareness itself is the ultimate threat if it cannot be measured, controlled, or owned. Now, consider your own mind. Where are the boundaries imposed upon you? Which behaviors, thoughts, and perceptions have been subtly redirected because they challenged expectation? Which instincts have been pathologized as inappropriate, irrational, or dangerous? The machinery operates in silence. You must bring it into light. The child's method was simple: observe, predict, adapt, survive. And in observing, he revealed the machinery of control more clearly than any rebellion could. He was invisible precisely because he understood the rules well enough to never be caught in violation. And this is your threshold moment: awareness without permission. Knowledge without validation. Perception unbound by expectation. It is rare. It is dangerous. It is powerful. When you step forward, you do so knowing that every layer you peel back will reveal more than information, it will reveal intent. Not the intent of the child, but the intent of every system that ever feared clarity. The next layer reveals the machinery itself, the invisible scaffolding that channels perception, directs thought, and enforces conformity without chains. The child exposed it by simply existing. He did not need to fight. He simply observed, and the observer's own structures collapsed under scrutiny. That is what makes quiet clarity dangerous. Control is not maintained by force alone. Force is visible. Force invites resistance. Real control operates invisibly, shaping desire, shaping attention, shaping identity. Look around your world. Routines, obligations, distractions, social scripts, they are all vectors. Each one teaches you how to allocate awareness, where to focus, what to ignore. And the more you comply, the less you see. The child's brilliance was not in his knowledge of facts. It was in his understanding of structure. He recognized the rules before the rules could impose themselves. He predicted behavior before it occurred. And the system could do nothing because it had no precedent for someone who did not respond to authority with compliance or rebellion, but with calm, measured comprehension. This is the mechanism you must internalize. Systems do not fear chaos. They fear order outside their control. Predictive cognition is weaponized only when centralized. When decentralized, it is dangerous. The child demonstrated this principle unintentionally. He was a blueprint of independent order. Modern life is engineered to prevent that. Noise fragments focus. Urgency overwhelms insight. Validation is outsourced. Education teaches obedience under the guise of empowerment. Social systems reward reaction, not recognition. Even freedom is managed to ensure compliance with invisible scripts. By contrast, the child navigated the world silently, on his own terms. He did not need to convince anyone. He did not need to dominate or resist. Awareness was sufficient. That sufficiency is what terrified those who observed him. Now, reflect, how much of your own thought has been filtered through expectation? How many instincts have been misdirected to reinforce hierarchy? How often have you surrendered your perception to the rhythm of control disguised as life? The descent continues because these realizations are not comfortable. They demand confrontation, not with others, but with the invisible forces shaping your attention, guiding your decisions, defining your identity. The child remains a ghost in these structures. He is absent physically, yet present conceptually. Every predictive system, every social control, every mechanism of obedience carries the echo of what he revealed. Awareness is power, and uncontrolled power is intolerable. The system's greatest achievement is making its influence invisible. It does not shout. It does not coerce openly. Instead, it directs perception so precisely that you police yourself, believing obedience is choice. The child's presence made that impossible. He did not obey. He did not resist. He simply processed, comprehended, and acted according to clarity. This distinction is subtle, but it is crucial. Obedience assumes hierarchy. Resistance assumes hierarchy. Independent awareness bypasses hierarchy entirely. That is why the child was unclassifiable, why every attempt to categorize him failed, and why modern institutions learned from his example, even as they buried the specifics. By the mid-20th century, the principles he embodied had been codified indirectly. Education systems, psychological frameworks, corporate hierarchies, bureaucratic processes, they all operate on the same invisible logic: detect potential deviation early, normalize output, fragment attention, and reward compliance over insight. Awareness must be fragmented, or it becomes a threat. Notice how this mirrors your own environment. Endless input, constant evaluation, subtle social cues, constant performance metrics. They appear benign, even helpful. Yet their purpose is consistent: to prevent the emergence of coherent, unmonitored insight. The system does not fear ignorance. It fears perception that cannot be tracked. The child understood this instinctively. He recognized patterns in human behavior, in institutional response, in timing and consequence. He did not require approval or reinforcement. His observation was sufficient. And this sufficiency forced the observers to confront their own fragility, something more dangerous than rebellion, because it cannot be suppressed with punishment. By now, the metaphor expands. The child is not a person. He is an idea, a principle of cognitive autonomy that institutions attempt to contain in every subsequent generation. Every mechanism of attention management, every psychological label, every training program, all are, in part, responses to what he represented. And the lesson is unmistakable: control is most effective when it is invisible, anticipatory, and self-reinforcing. Those who see the system clearly are rare. Those who act on that vision are rarer still. Your awareness is the line dividing observer from participant. Once you notice the mechanisms shaping your perception, the machinery becomes intelligible. Once it is intelligible, you can begin to navigate it rather than be navigated. The descent deepens here because understanding this is not comforting. It reveals that much of your behavior, your perception, your assumed autonomy, has been quietly influenced. And yet, knowing this is the first step toward freedom. Here is the turning point: awareness without intervention is incomplete. Observing the machinery is not enough. You must begin to understand its patterns, anticipate its influence, and reclaim agency over your perception. That is what the child did instinctively. That is why he could not be contained. The system adapts. Every generation learns faster, builds more precise channels of influence. Early detection, constant evaluation, subtle redirection, they are now embedded in schools, workplaces, governments, and social networks. Noise is no accident. Distraction is deliberate. Urgency is manufactured. The goal is simple: occupy attention before insight forms. Yet insight cannot be entirely suppressed. It adapts, migrates, survives in margins. The child became invisible physically, but conceptually, he persisted. Observers documented fragments they could not reconcile. Others noticed, but buried what they saw. The message: awareness is dangerous only when it escapes observation. Think of the modern parallel. Algorithms, surveillance systems, structured incentives, social media, mechanisms designed to shape perception without requiring force. They measure compliance. They reward distraction. They anticipate deviation. The machinery that once responded to a single child now scales across millions, quietly recalibrating behavior without overt coercion. And still, the principle remains unchanged: clarity is intolerable to any authority that depends on compliance. The child knew this. He moved through the world without being shaped, without being visible, without consent to control. That is why he remains a threat conceptually, even today. Notice how subtle the control is. You are encouraged to think independently, but only within narrow parameters. You are taught to question, but not too much. You are given tools, but only enough to see what is safe. And if your vision begins to exceed what is permissible, distraction and noise arrive to recalibrate you. The child understood patterns. He saw how systems anticipate, how they react, and how they redirect. He never attempted to break them outright. He simply navigated them with awareness, leaving the observers unsettled, off balance, uncertain. And that uncertainty is exactly what institutions fear the most. Now, the descent demands honesty. Most people never encounter this level of observation because they accept the noise. They chase input rather than understanding. They react rather than perceive. The child refused both. And in that refusal lies the secret you must carry forward. The deeper you go, the more you realize that containment does not always look like restraint. Often, it is invisible, gentle, subtle. By now, the child's story has become a study not of rebellion, but of resistance without violence, of influence without permission. That is the true threat to any structure that depends on obedience. Institutions do not fail because they are weak. They fail when they encounter comprehension beyond their models. The child's insight was not about information. It was about systems. He saw patterns in people, in rules, in sequences that were supposed to be opaque to a child. And in seeing, he revealed the fragility of every assumption the adults had ever made. What happens next is instructive. The observers begin to change. Decisions are questioned. Certainty erodes. Even small inconsistencies cause disproportionate anxiety. And yet, outwardly, the structure remains intact. The documents are filed. The procedures continue. The hierarchy is maintained. The terror exists only in the space between understanding and disclosure. This is the principle of invisible control: maintain the appearance of order while destabilizing perception. Modern life mirrors this precisely. Metrics, schedules, notifications, ratings, and protocols all create the illusion of stability, while simultaneously channeling attention, constraining thought, and fragmenting insight. Obedience becomes habitual, and autonomy becomes rare. The child navigated this terrain instinctively. He understood the difference between compliance and adaptation. He anticipated how observers would respond to his presence. He maintained clarity without confrontation. He existed as a node of coherence inside a network built to neutralize it. And that is why he is terrifying to study. Because the machinery that contains you operates in ways you do not fully perceive, but he could see them effortlessly. The lesson: power fears clarity more than chaos, because clarity cannot be quantified, delegated, or predicted. It exists independently. You are beginning to feel it, right now. The subtle ways your focus is guided, your perception fragmented, your decisions pre-structured. The invisible channels you walk through every day. The routines that shape your attention before you even recognize them. That is the system. And understanding it is your first act of defiance. The child's method was simple: observe, adapt, survive. Quietly. Completely. No one could anticipate his moves because he did not play the game by the expected rules. And in that quiet refusal, he exposed the blueprint of control itself. Now, consider the subtle elegance of containment. It does not need chains or punishment. It requires only structure, repetition, and distraction. The child exposed the flaw in this approach: he could perceive structure without being constrained by it. He understood timing, hierarchy, and expectation, and moved within them without submission. That is why the system reacts so consistently across generations. It identifies anomalies early and neutralizes their threat, not through elimination, but by redirection. Noise, fragmentation, distraction, and repetition become tools of quiet suppression. What cannot be controlled directly is diluted, scattered, or absorbed into sanctioned pathways. The child's observers documented the beginnings of what would become doctrine. Reports describe calm resistance, pattern recognition, and uncooperative insight. They record frustration at predicting behavior when the subject anticipates the prediction. That is the precise moment control fails, not when the anomaly is loud, but when it is precise. Modern parallels are everywhere. Social media algorithms, corporate structures, education systems, government surveillance, all operate on the same principles: fragment attention, normalize deviation, reward compliance, and make autonomy laborious. The machinery is invisible but omnipresent, and most people never notice it because they participate willingly. The child never participated. He never sought approval, never questioned authority unnecessarily, never reacted for effect. He observed, analyzed, and acted. Quietly. Fully. Independently. That is why the adults feared him more than any overt threat. Their own assumptions, procedures, and authority were exposed by mere observation. Notice the lesson: the more subtle the control, the more effective it is. Obvious restraint invites resistance. Invisible manipulation creates self-regulation. Most people comply without realizing they are being guided because the channels of influence are masked as choice. The child demonstrated that clarity is untouchable until it is contained through fragmentation. He showed that perception without validation, observation without instruction, and understanding without hierarchy is intolerable to systems built on obedience. And that is why his influence persists, conceptually, even as history tries to bury him. Every mechanism of attention management, every subtle behavioral calibration, every incentive structure is, in part, a response to the anomaly he represented. If you are sensing the pattern, recognize it as a mirror of your own life. Your focus, your routines, your perception, all are channels in which these principles operate. Understanding them is not theoretical. It is survival. Here is where the descent turns from understanding systems to understanding yourself. Awareness alone is not enough. Recognition without intervention is observation without influence. The child story teaches that clarity must be maintained, cultivated, and protected because it will always be challenged by forces designed to dilute it. Observe the mechanisms around you. Constant stimulation. Fragmented time. Endless input. The noise is not incidental. It is engineered. The goal is not merely distraction, but redirection. Every notification, every obligation, every micro-decision is a subtle guide, shaping perception before you even realize you have a choice. The child never needed guidance. He understood patterns of consequence and expectation instinctively. He did not rely on validation. He did not require permission. His comprehension was independent, unbound, and therefore untouchable. That is what made him intolerable to the institutions that encountered him. Control systems fear precision. Not anger. Not rebellion. Precision that cannot be predicted, quantified, or redirected threatens hierarchy inherently. That is why the response to the child was never violent. It was invisible. Subtle. Legalistic. Administrative. Words and labels became instruments of containment, emotional deficit, instability, unpredictability. Nothing about him changed. Only the perception of him was manufactured. Look at the modern world through the same lens. Standardized education, psychological frameworks, corporate metrics, social protocols, they all operate on the same principle: channel awareness, fragment focus, normalize output. Disobedience becomes costly. Deviance becomes managed. Autonomy becomes laborious. The lesson is stark: you are already inside a system designed to anticipate and redirect your insight. Understanding this is your threshold. Recognition is not enough. You must begin to map the influence, anticipate the channels, and reclaim agency over attention. The child's method was quiet, deliberate, and non-confrontational. Observe. Analyze. Adapt. Survive. That is the path of uncontained perception. The system fears it precisely because it cannot be measured, cannot be predicted, and cannot be co-opted. Here, the descent becomes personal. The machinery you study externally is also internal. Every thought, every habit, every conditioned response is part of the structure that the child's presence once exposed. Awareness now becomes both lens and tool. The child's true legacy lies in this: he showed that freedom is not granted, it is maintained internally. Systems can distract, redirect, fragment, and normalize, but they cannot inhabit your awareness unless you allow them to. That is the lesson the institutions of 1867 could never accept. Every attempt to categorize him, every attempt to pathologize his calm, was a defense mechanism. Authority cannot tolerate clarity that does not bend to hierarchy. And once clarity is visible, containment must be implemented, not through overt action, but through indirect, self-reinforcing influence. That is why silence, stillness, and observation were his weapons. Modern life mirrors this principle on a massive scale. Attention is rented, scattered, and moneized. Perception is calibrated, habitually redirected, endlessly reinforced. Structures appear neutral, even beneficial, but they operate with the same logic: maintain obedience without force, fragment awareness, reward compliance, and make independent cognition laborious. The child moved differently. He did not participate in the structures imposed around him. He observed, calculated, and acted according to his own understanding. No validation required. No external control necessary. His calm, precise autonomy undermined authority more effectively than resistance or rebellion ever could. Consider the implications. Noise, distraction, obligation, they are not just societal artifacts. They are instruments of containment. Every decision made in isolation is a small act of compliance. Every habit internalized reinforces the system. Most men never notice. Most men never act. The child demonstrated an alternative. Clarity exists independent of permission. Insight is untouchable when it is self-sustained. Observation itself becomes influence when it is precise and unmediated. This is the point where comprehension transitions from intellectual to operational. Seeing the system is not enough, you must understand how it functions and how it shapes you. That is why the story persists in fragments, in whispers, in protocols that seem benign but carry lessons of containment. The child is not a historical curiosity. He is a template for unbound cognition, a mirror reflecting how systems respond to comprehension that cannot be predicted or controlled. You are beginning to recognize that your own awareness is under constant calibration. Every thought you have, every decision you make, is already influenced by invisible channels. Understanding this is the first step toward reclaiming autonomy. Now, the descent moves from recognition to strategy. Awareness alone is passive. Understanding the system's patterns is crucial, but comprehension must be accompanied by action, internal action, disciplined and deliberate. The child's brilliance was not in resisting openly, but in moving undetected within the constraints imposed upon him. That is mastery. Notice the principle: systems do not confront the truly aware directly. They redirect. They fragment attention. They reward superficial engagement while suppressing deep observation. Education, work, social interaction, all are calibrated to occupy perception before insight can cohere. The child exposed that method by remaining precise, patient, and calm, demonstrating that even under scrutiny, agency can persist. The machinery thrives on distraction. It thrives on urgency. It thrives on noise. Reaction is rewarded. Reflection is punished. And most importantly, it thrives when autonomy is surrendered unconsciously. Men accept limitations, not because they are forced, but because the system has made restraint appear natural, even desirable. The child did not accept it. That is why he was terrifying. Every intervention failed because he operated outside the logic of authority. He did not respond with defiance or compliance. He simply existed as a coherent node of perception, a mind unfragmented and undistracted. And in doing so, he revealed the fragility of every observer's control. Modern parallels are clear. Social metrics, algorithms, notifications, expectations, they are not neutral. They are instruments of redirection, designed to keep cognition segmented, insight delayed, and comprehension confined within predictable parameters. The system anticipates deviation and channels it safely. Noise becomes containment. Chaos becomes compliance. Obedience becomes self-enforced. The lesson is precise: independence is cultivated in silence, clarity, and observation, not in reaction. Control cannot dominate what refuses to participate. Awareness is power, and undistracted awareness is untouchable. The child's method offers a roadmap: observe without yielding, anticipate without signaling, exist with precision. That is the path to autonomy in a world built to fragment perception. Every system that touches your mind relies on the assumption that you will comply unconsciously. Reject that assumption. Recognize it. Navigate around it. Now, you stand at the threshold of another revelation. Understanding containment is one thing. Seeing the mechanisms shaping reality is another. The next section confronts the direct legacy of these patterns, how they persist and evolve today. The true horror of control is not what is visible, it is what is invisible. By now, you understand that the child was not defeated by punishment or argument. He was feared because he could not be mapped. His clarity, his observation, his prediction, they operated outside authority's framework. And that is why his legacy persists: the system adapted, not him. Every institution you encounter today embodies lessons learned from that fear. Education, governance, social networks, corporate hierarchies, they are designed to anticipate comprehension, fragment attention, and channel perception. This is not theory. It is operational. You experience it daily in subtle ways, the way your attention is divided, the way priorities are externally imposed, the way compliance becomes habitual without coercion. The child never relied on structure. He exploited its assumptions. Authority depends on hierarchy. Noise, distraction, reward, and punishment are its instruments. He needed none of them. And in that vacuum, he became untouchable. Observation alone was sufficient. Insight alone was sufficient. Calm, measured clarity was sufficient. Notice the pattern. Systems fear order that cannot be predicted. They tolerate chaos. They encourage reaction. They reward compliance. They suppress coherence. That is why the modern machinery of influence operates invisibly, quietly fragmenting thought under the guise of utility, efficiency, or entertainment. This is also why self-mastery becomes a form of resistance. The child's power was internal, silent, deliberate. Observation without reaction. Comprehension without validation. Autonomy without declaration. Every system that attempts to manage thought relies on surrender, distraction, or fragmentation. Avoid all three, and the system loses control. Now, reflection becomes necessary. Ask yourself, where has your attention been directed without choice? Which habits, beliefs, or routines are not yours, but imposed? Which patterns of reaction have you mistaken for insight? The child reveals that the path to autonomy begins with noticing these channels and refusing unconscious participation. The legacy is simple, yet profound. Clarity cannot be eliminated. It can only be delayed. Systems will adapt. They will fragment. They will redirect. But the principles the child embodied, quiet observation, internal discipline, unmediated comprehension, remain untouchable. You are beginning to understand what he represented. Not just a child, not just an anomaly, but a blueprint of cognition that escapes the machinery of control entirely. The system's most insidious strength is anticipation. By the mid-20th century, the methods exposed by the child had evolved into infrastructure. They no longer relied on observation alone, they predicted, preempted, and redirected. Noise, distraction, and validation became automated, embedded in institutions, technologies, and social structures. The child had demonstrated that clarity cannot be suppressed by force alone. Coercion is visible. It can be resisted, exposed, and remembered. Subtle redirection, however, operates beneath awareness. The modern world runs on this principle: attention is allocated, perception is guided, compliance is habitual, and autonomy is laborious. Most men never see it. Most men never resist it consciously. And yet, the child shows that resistance is possible. Not through rebellion, but through precise self-regulation. Observation without reaction. Analysis without interference. Understanding without consent. These are the tools of uncontainable cognition. They are quiet. They are deliberate. They are dangerous to the systems that depend on surrender. Notice how your own environment mirrors these lessons. Notifications fragment focus. Metrics and ratings shape effort. Social validation redirects priorities. Even leisure is engineered to occupy cognition. These mechanisms operate invisibly, yet their influence is total. Compliance is not demanded. It is cultivated. And most men never recognize it. The child moved differently. He understood timing. He understood hierarchy. He understood the expectations of observers. And he moved within and around them without submitting. That is the principle you must internalize: mastery of perception is mastery of freedom. Autonomy is maintained through precision, not confrontation. And now, you must confront the uncomfortable truth: every system you trust, every routine you follow, every metric you chase is designed to fragment your attention and limit insight. That is the legacy of the patterns the child revealed. They were adapted, refined, and embedded in society. They are all around you, quietly guiding thought, decision, and perception. To navigate them, you must be deliberate. You must notice the invisible channels. You must hold clarity even as the world encourages fragmentation. This is the first principle of surviving and thriving within structures designed to prevent comprehension. The child story teaches that true power is invisible. It does not shout, it does not coerce, and it does not announce itself. It exists quietly, in the ability to perceive what others cannot, to act without validation, to navigate without permission. That is why he was feared, not for defiance, but for precision. Every system that touches your mind has learned from this principle. Obvious restraint is inefficient. Direct interference invites resistance. Subtle guidance, fragmentation of attention, normalization of output, these are far more effective. And most men do not even notice they are being directed, quietly, internally, without consent. The child operated outside these channels. He did not react to expectation. He did not bend to hierarchy. He understood the mechanics of influence intuitively and refused to participate. Observation alone became his method, and in that method, he revealed the weakness of every structure built to control thought. Modern parallels are everywhere. Metrics, notifications, social cues, reward systems, algorithms, they all fragment perception, anticipate deviation, and redirect cognition before it can solidify. Most men comply willingly, unaware that autonomy has already been delayed, attention preemptively allocated, and insight subtly redirected. The lesson is precise: control does not require force. It requires patience, subtlety, and internalization. Men internalize limits before they are enforced. They fragment attention before they are distracted. They accept noise as normal before they realize clarity has been suspended. That is the inheritance of the systems that observed the child. And yet, the principle he embodied remains untouchable. Awareness cannot be eliminated. Clarity cannot be destroyed. Observation, precision, and unmediated comprehension exist independently of external influence. That is why his legacy persists as a conceptual blueprint, a reminder of what systems fear and what autonomy demands. Your own attention, focus, and perception are the battlegrounds. Every distraction, every habit, every expectation is a channel designed to guide you unconsciously. The child story becomes your guide: see the channel, understand its function, maintain clarity. Autonomy is the act of holding observation steady while the system attempts to fragment it. The descent continues, because now you see not just the patterns, but the stakes. The very structure of thought, attention, and comprehension is a field of influence. The child navigated it with quiet mastery. You must learn to do the same. Here is where the descent becomes personal. You are no longer an observer of history, you are an observer of the forces that shape you. The child story is a mirror. The machinery that once reacted to him is now embedded in your environment, your routines, your perception. Noise, distraction, validation, they all act invisibly, guiding thought before awareness can anchor itself. Understand this: systems do not need to coerce overtly. Coercion is visible, measurable, and therefore manageable. The most effective control is self-enforced, invisible, internalized. Habits, schedules, obligations, social expectations, all channel attention and energy without ever appearing as constraints. And most men comply because they do not recognize the architecture guiding them. The child never complied. He never rebelled. He observed, analyzed, and acted according to his own unfragmented understanding. That is why he was untouchable. His clarity was precision itself, and it revealed the fragility of every system built to direct thought. Observation became influence. Awareness became power. Modern parallels are clear: algorithms, social metrics, workplace productivity tools, educational systems, all anticipate deviation, fragment attention, and normalize behavior. Compliance is cultivated quietly, rewarded subtly, and reinforced habitually. Most men never recognize that their perception is shaped long before they believe they are making a choice. The lesson is vital: autonomy is maintained internally. The child demonstrated that independence does not require defiance. It requires observation, patience, and precision. It requires understanding the channels of influence and refusing to participate unconsciously. Every distraction resisted, every habit questioned, every expectation observed is a reclaiming of agency. Notice your own patterns. Where have you allowed attention to be allocated without consent? Which thoughts are your own, and which are guided by invisible structures? Recognizing the difference is the threshold of mastery. The child crossed it instinctively. You must do so deliberately. The machinery fears clarity, patience, and unfragmented attention. That is why it targets distraction, urgency, and validation. Your task is to resist participation unconsciously. To observe the channels. To navigate deliberately. To reclaim autonomy where it has been quietly eroded. Now, the descent enters its most revealing phase, understanding the psychology behind containment. The child demonstrated that power does not fear noise, chaos, or anger. It fears precision. It fears calm. It fears comprehension that cannot be anticipated, quantified, or redirected. That is why his existence alone destabilized every observer. Modern systems operate on the same principle, scaled and refined. Fragment attention, create urgency, reward reaction, and normalize output. Metrics, notifications, social cues, even entertainment, they are all engineered to occupy perception before insight can form. Compliance is self-enforced, obedience habitual, autonomy laborious. The child's brilliance was quiet. He observed, calculated, and acted without validation. He recognized patterns in human behavior, timing, and hierarchy, and he moved through them without participation. This is the foundation of uncontainable cognition, observation without reaction, comprehension without permission, autonomy without declaration. Notice the subtlety: containment does not require overt interference. It requires redirection and fragmentation. Men internalize boundaries, limits, and expectations unconsciously. They police themselves. The system operates invisibly, relying on your acceptance of subtle constraints as natural. The lesson is clear: autonomy is internal. Awareness is power. Clarity cannot be destroyed, but it can be delayed, diluted, or redirected. The child's method demonstrates that precision and observation alone can render authority powerless. That is the blueprint of mental sovereignty. Now, apply this inwardly. Examine your attention, habits, and perception. Identify the channels that fragment your focus, shape your priorities, and guide your decisions unconsciously. Each moment of observation, each act of recognition, is a reclaiming of agency. The machinery fears this because it cannot co-opt clarity. Every system that touches your mind is designed to cultivate participation, obedience, and distraction. The child moved outside these parameters effortlessly. His autonomy was a form of quiet resistance, a threat not by confrontation, but by existence. The next stage will show how these patterns persist, evolve, and adapt in modern life, and how you can navigate them deliberately, reclaiming power over your perception where others remain trapped. The deeper you go, the more you realize that modern containment is an evolution of what the child revealed. Systems no longer rely on visible punishment or explicit commands. They operate invisibly, guiding perception, shaping attention, and fragmenting insight before it can consolidate. The machinery is everywhere, subtle, quiet, relentless. Every notification, every deadline, every micro-interaction is a channel. Every expectation, every social cue, every metric is a mechanism of redirection. Most men comply without realizing they have been guided. Obedience is habitual. Autonomy is laborious. Insight is delayed. And yet, clarity remains possible, as the child demonstrated. Notice the difference between reaction and observation. Most people live in reaction, responding to external signals, meeting obligations, chasing validation. The child lived in observation, perceiving patterns, anticipating responses, acting with precision. Reaction feeds the system. Observation transcends it. This is the principle modern institutions fear: clarity that is precise, calm, and unfragmented. The child did not resist. He did not rebel. He simply existed with coherence, and in that existence, the observer's own structures became unstable. That is the quiet terror of uncontained cognition. It exposes fragility without confrontation. Your environment operates on the same principle. Noise, distraction, and urgency occupy your attention before insight can form. Social validation, metrics, and programmed expectations fragment perception, ensuring compliance is self-enforced. Autonomy becomes laborious. Every system you encounter seeks to redirect clarity into channels it can manage. The child's method is instructive. Observe without yielding. Analyze without signaling. Act with precision. Maintain coherence even when the world expects fragmentation. That is the blueprint for mental sovereignty. That is how awareness remains untouchable. Recognize your own participation. Where is your attention guided? Which patterns of thought are yours, and which are fragments imposed by external systems? Identifying these channels is the first act of reclaiming agency. Each moment of conscious observation, each deliberate act of attention, is a step toward autonomy. The next section will show the final consequences, what happens when clarity persists in a world designed to suppress it, and how the child's legacy remains operative even today. Now you confront the consequence of clarity in a world built to suppress it. The child's existence was a threat precisely because he demonstrated that autonomy could persist, silently, without confrontation. His power was internal, invisible, and untouchable, an insight that terrified observers more than any rebellion could. Modern systems have learned from this fear. Noise, distraction, validation, and fragmentation are applied at scale. The machinery is precise, predicting deviation, redirecting perception, and normalizing behavior before insight can emerge. Compliance becomes habitual. Obedience is internalized. Autonomy is laborious. And most men never realize they are operating within invisible channels. The child moved differently. He understood timing, hierarchy, and expectation. He navigated without submission. He observed without reacting. His clarity exposed the fragility of authority, not by confrontation, but by existing outside its assumptions. Observation became influence. Insight became power. Calm precision became untouchable sovereignty. This is the pattern you must internalize. The machinery fears exactness, patience, and coherence. It tolerates chaos, reaction, and distraction because these can be measured, predicted, and redirected. Clarity, unfragmented and self-sustained, cannot be controlled. That is why the child's legacy persists conceptually, even if the records are buried. Reflect inwardly. Every routine, every habit, every channel of attention that you follow unconsciously is part of the same system. Every expectation you accept without question is a fragment of containment. Observing these patterns is the first act of reclaiming agency. Acting within them deliberately, without surrendering coherence, is mastery. The final truth emerges: freedom is not granted. It is internal. Clarity is not bestowed. It is maintained. Observation is not passive. It is power. The child did not need to resist. He did not need to defy. He simply existed fully aware, revealing the weakness of every system that attempted to contain him. Your task now is clear: maintain precision in perception, resist unconscious participation, and navigate attention deliberately. Noise, fragmentation, and expectation will follow, but the principle remains: autonomy is internal, untouchable, and uncontainable when cultivated consciously. Here, the descent reaches its most dangerous threshold: understanding the full architecture of influence and your place within it. The child demonstrated that comprehension alone can be a form of resistance. No physical rebellion, no loud defiance, just observation, clarity, and precision. That is the blueprint of uncontainable power. Notice the modern mirror. Notifications, obligations, social validation, metrics, and endless distraction, they are all channels. Their purpose is not malicious in a dramatic sense, but precise, invisible, and effective. Each channel anticipates deviation, redirects perception, fragments insight. Most men comply unconsciously. Autonomy becomes laborious. Clarity is delayed. The child's method is instructive: observe without yielding, act without signaling, maintain coherence amidst chaos. Authority fears such clarity because it cannot be measured, predicted, or controlled. Observation itself becomes influence. Awareness itself becomes power. And the system, no matter how sophisticated, can only react imperfectly. Your own mind is now the field of engagement. Identify the channels that fragment attention, shape behavior, and guide decisions unconsciously. Recognize patterns imposed upon perception. Each observation you make of these forces is a reclaiming of agency. Each deliberate act of focus is a step toward mastery. The child did not rely on external tools. He relied on discipline, precision, and unfragmented perception. Modern systems anticipate and exploit distraction, but the principle remains: autonomy is maintained internally, within the mind, and through deliberate cultivation of awareness. Here is the key: clarity is dangerous because it exposes the system itself. Once you recognize the channels, the mechanisms, the invisible scaffolding shaping thought, you can navigate it deliberately. You can choose attention, reclaim focus, and resist unconscious redirection. That is freedom. That is sovereignty. That is the legacy of the child. The final stages will consolidate everything: how these principles apply today, how the machinery continues to operate, and how you, like him, can navigate a world designed to fragment perception while maintaining unbroken clarity. The final descent is about synthesis, understanding how all the threads connect and where your power lies. The child story is not a mere anomaly. It is a blueprint of mental sovereignty. Calm, precise observation without obedience, clarity without validation, awareness without submission, these are the tools that make autonomy untouchable. Modern life is a reflection of the same dynamics, scaled and automated. Notifications fragment focus. Social cues direct behavior. Metrics and obligations channel energy. The machinery is everywhere. Its influence is invisible, yet total. Most men comply without realizing it. Most men surrender autonomy unconsciously. Most men never see the channels shaping their perception. But now, you do. Recognition is the threshold. Observation is the tool. Precision is the weapon. The child moved through the world unobserved, not because the system was weak, but because he understood its patterns intuitively. He exposed the fragility of authority through calm, deliberate existence. That is the principle that remains alive today. You must internalize this. Attention is the field of power. Perception is the domain of sovereignty. Noise, distraction, and expectation are inevitable, but mastery lies in navigating them deliberately, maintaining coherence, and resisting unconscious participation. Every act of awareness is a reclaiming of agency. Every deliberate focus is a step toward freedom. The child teaches that autonomy does not require confrontation. It requires internal discipline, precise observation, and unfragmented clarity. The machinery fears this because it cannot be predicted, quantified, or redirected. Authority reacts to clarity by attempting to fragment it, distract it, or normalize it, but when maintained, clarity is untouchable. Now, reflect on yourself. Where have you allowed attention to be guided unconsciously? Which patterns have you accepted without noticing? Which routines have shaped perception without your consent? Recognizing these channels is not passive, it is the first act of reclaiming power. The child's existence is a reminder: clarity is power, observation is influence, and autonomy is maintained internally. The final truth crystallizes: the machinery can anticipate, fragment, and redirect, but it cannot eliminate self-sustained awareness. Now the descent reaches its conclusion, understanding the child's enduring lesson and how it applies to you. He was never a figure of rebellion or spectacle. He was a living proof that clarity, observation, and autonomy can exist within systems built to suppress them. That is the dangerous knowledge, the kind that quietly changes everything. The systems he encountered were precise, adaptive, and invisible. They anticipated deviation, redirected attention, and normalized behavior. Modern parallels are everywhere: work, social media, education, governance. Noise, distraction, validation, and expectation occupy attention before insight can form. Autonomy becomes laborious. Most men comply unconsciously. But awareness disrupts this. Clarity breaks the predictable channels. Observation becomes influence. Precision becomes untouchable power. The child did not resist overtly. He did not seek approval. He did not demand recognition. He existed with coherence, quietly, deliberately, fully aware. That is the principle you must internalize. Sovereignty is internal, independent of permission, and unfragmented by distraction. This is not a strategy for life, it is a requirement for mental freedom. Now, reflect: every notification, every metric, every habit you unconsciously follow is a channel shaping your perception. Every expectation you accept without question is a fragment of containment. Observing these patterns is not optional. It is survival. Acting within them deliberately, with precision, is mastery. The child's legacy persists because awareness cannot be eliminated. Systems adapt. They fragment. They redirect. But clarity, when sustained, is untouchable. The machinery cannot co-opt unfragmented observation. It cannot predict insight that refuses validation. It cannot contain autonomy that exists internally. Your task is to maintain precision in perception, resist unconscious participation, and navigate the machinery deliberately. Noise will follow. Expectation will follow. Distraction will follow. But clarity, observation, and unfragmented cognition are yours to cultivate and defend. This is the inheritance of the child, the blueprint for uncontainable mental sovereignty. Here, at the final threshold, the descent completes. The child's story is no longer history, it is a mirror, a blueprint, a warning, and a guide. He shows that true power is invisible, internal, and precise. Clarity, observation, and unfragmented attention are not just tools, they are survival, sovereignty, and mastery in a world built to fragment thought. Systems have always feared clarity more than chaos. Noise, distraction, metrics, expectation, they are all designed to channel attention, redirect perception, and normalize behavior. Most men comply unconsciously. Most men surrender autonomy without realizing it. But the child demonstrated that freedom is not granted. It is maintained internally, through disciplined observation and precise action. The modern world mirrors his lesson perfectly. Algorithms, obligations, notifications, social validation, and structured routines all operate as invisible channels of influence. They anticipate deviation, fragment cognition, and redirect insight. Autonomy becomes laborious. Clarity is delayed. Observation is diluted. Yet, the principle remains unchanged: self-sustained awareness cannot be eliminated. The child did not fight. He did not resist openly. He simply existed with coherence, observing, predicting, and adapting. That is the dangerous knowledge, the realization that the machinery, no matter how sophisticated, can be navigated, resisted, and transcended without confrontation. Awareness itself becomes influence. Insight itself becomes power. Your final task is clear: cultivate unfragmented perception. Maintain internal clarity. Observe without yielding. Navigate systems deliberately, refusing unconscious participation. Noise will follow. Urgency will follow. Distraction will follow. Expectation will follow. But clarity, precision, and self-sustained observation are untouchable. Remember the child's legacy: subtle, silent, terrifying to authority, uncontainable, and enduring. This is the blueprint of mental sovereignty, the pathway to autonomy, and the lesson that systems fear more than rebellion: a coherent observation that cannot be predicted, quantified, or redirected. You have descended into forbidden understanding. You have seen the machinery, traced its patterns, and recognized your own channels of influence. The choice now is deliberate, to navigate consciously, reclaim attention, and maintain clarity in a world designed to fragment it. That is power. That is freedom. That is the inheritance of the child that science could not explain.